I am Praveen Kasuri. I teach here at Penn and run the entrepreneurship clinic, which seemingly has nothing to do with visual advocacy, except that I do economic development work and am trying to figure out ways to use the visual medium to tell economic development stories. And so anyway, I love the morning session. Hopefully the afternoon will be equally as inspiring. But I'm here to get ideas like many of you. And I'm going to be moderating this panel, which basically means I'm the traffic cop, and I'll give you guys instructions sort of at the end in terms of how we're going to do this. But once upon a time, before I came here, I was a public defender in Chicago. And today we're going to be talking, or this right now, we're going to be talking about video in the pursuit of justice. And we have with us Carol Jacobsen, who is going to show us some of her work. She is a professor at the University of Michigan in the School of Art and Design, also a professor in the Women's Studies program there, as well as in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. She is also a Human Rights Fellow in the International Perspective on Human Rights program. Her works address issues of women's criminalization and censorship, and her art has been exhibited around the world, including in the countries of Spain, Germany, Belgium, Italy, New Zealand, China, and then here in the United States in places like New York's Lincoln Center and the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. She is also the director of the Michigan Women's Justice and Clemency Project, where she advocates for the human rights of women prisoners and seeks the freedom for women incarcerated for murder, but who acted in self-defense. Commenting on Ms. Jacobsen's work will be William DiMascio, who is the executive director of the Pennsylvania Prison Society and has been so for the last 10 years. Before that, he served as a consultant to correctional policy advocates in Pennsylvania, North and South Carolina, Oklahoma, and Oregon. And during that time, he authored a fact book entitled Seeking Justice, Crime and Punishment in America, which is a reference work distributed across the country. Had a previous career as a journalist, and he will comment on the work. So just in terms of housekeeping, I'm going to turn it over to Carol. We're going to let both of them present and then field questions at the end. So unless you have something that's really, really burning, hold your questions till the end so that we can try to stay on schedule and then also accommodate as many folks as possible. Ms. Jacobsen.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Regina Austin also for inviting me to this wonderful roundtable today. I'm so happy to be here. I have some images from the Clemency Project and from my documentaries and installations and photographs as I talk about my work and role as director of the Michigan Women's Justice and Clemency Project. I also have several film clips then to show you so that you can hear from the women some of the women that I work with directly. And then I'll look forward to your questions and discussion. When I first went into a women's prison, this is a shot from our annual rally at the state capitol for the Clemency Project. When I first went into the women's prison in 1989 to make a film with women inside, I had been interviewing and filming women on the streets of Detroit, street workers, for about 4 years, and I thought I'd continue that project inside the prison, but when I got there I was shocked to discover who the so-called murderers are, excuse me, in our U.S. women's prisons. Many, if not most, are women who acted in self-defense against their batterers. I became interested in issues of women's criminalization and representation, visual and legal, for many reasons. I grew up in the shadow of the world's largest walled prison at Jackson, Michigan, which affected me in ways that are indelible, if not always discernible. I know that it alerted me to the horror that we're all living in the shadow of a prison today in the world's most incarcerated country, as a toxic consequence of the complicity between our politicians and corporate media, which have both traded on public fear and bigotry for their elections and profits. I was also drawn to these issues because I had also committed a crime. When I was 17, I had an illegal abortion in order to sever all ties to a batterer that I'd eloped with out of high school. I was lucky I didn't die, almost, but not quite. And I wasn't prosecuted for my crime, and I had friends and family to hide me until the stalking ended. Later, in graduate school in the late 70s, as I began my fledgling efforts at addressing feminist issues in my art, I got my first taste of censorship, mostly in the form of ridicule. But censors are lurking everywhere, even inside ourselves, as self-appointed guards of the boundaries of social and political conventions. As I joined artist and activist groups in New York and London after graduate school, I became more and more electrified by the possibilities I could accomplish with my art and the creative politics that I was participating in. I knew I had to find ways to activate my work. I learned a lot at Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp outside London, Southall Black Sisters, and seeing feminists on trial in British courts for disturbing the peace and disorderly conduct. I began to see the connections between my own feelings of shame and stigma and silence, a subject that Dr. Austin has written so eloquently on, about my own past, and so many shame-filled experiences that women deal with: abortion, rape, lesbian identity, prostitution, that are punished by the state. So when I returned to Michigan, I began going to court in Detroit to interview and film women who were also being prosecuted for disturbing the peace and disorderly conduct. They were street workers. And I sat through hundreds of arraignments for 4 summers. I'd pick a woman, I'd follow her out of the court and ask her if she was willing to talk to me. I told her I was, the second year I started filming, and I had a camera woman in the parking lot. And I paid women for their time. And I told them I was critical of the laws on prostitution and the jails and the conditions and the arrest process, and would they be willing to talk about it. And I think I only had 1 or 2 that ever said no, and mostly, often I had women lined up, probably because they heard I was paying $50 for 15 minutes. Amnesty, well, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Because of that project, then I was invited by an activist to come inside the prison and make a film with women inside. The first film was with some of these women on their children's visitation project, and that started in 1989. And I made that piece for them. But when I got inside, the shock of recognition of self was really tremendous, because I was meeting women who had been forced, as I had been, to commit a crime, break the law to get out alive. Amnesty International estimates that 70% of female murder victims are killed by partners worldwide, 1/3 in this country. 1 woman every 5 days in Michigan, where I live. Yet all governments fail to provide substantive resources to end the crisis of women abuse or to meet women's needs for survival. Worse, the survivors are punished if they commit a crime, despite the fact that they were abandoned by law enforcement and the criminal legal system. Interestingly, the number of men killed by female partners has steadily decreased over the last 30 years. However, the number of women murdered by male partners has not decreased significantly during that time. So many women continue to face lethal violence in the home. In prison, I saw the crushing institutionalized domination of sexualized violence. At first, I was struck by how beaten down the women were in this environment. But I soon realized that the system had only suppressed their resistance, not killed it. And I wanted to make a film that would bring them close up, face to face, with an audience that I was aiming at as primarily feminist, primarily activist, who could see and hear as I did their social critiques of the systems that failed them and that fail us all. In 1991, I met Susan Fair, here on the right, who was just released from prison and starting the Clemency Project, and she too was appalled by the cases of battered women who were serving life. Together, in the middle is Juanita Thomas, the first woman we got released from the prison from a life sentence in 1998. And together, Susan and I and a few attorneys have shaped a grassroots, all-volunteer effort focused on freeing women who never received due process or fair trials based on the facts of their cases. And we also focus on public education, research, and advocacy for human rights for women inside the prisons. We now represent, right now, about 40 women for clemency or parole, and each year we add a few more cases from our wait list of over 100. We estimate that about a third of the women serving time for murder in Michigan acted in self-defense against a batterer. Most women self-identify or friends or family contact us, but we now have files on all 360 about women serving time for murder, 1 or 2. Susan guided me through the hoops to get continued access in the prison and to the women that I didn't already know, and they trusted me because they trusted her. I wrote and conducted the interviews and did the editing, and so it's my subjective view together with theirs. Again, when I approached each woman, I explained my own story and told them why I was doing this, that it was meant for a feminist audience, and that some would call what I did murder. And I worked with women who volunteered to participate and who wanted to be part of the Clemency Project. From one prison, this is another woman, Violet Allen, that we got released in 1999, also on a motion for relief from judgment. Those two women, Juanita and Violet, we got out through court, not clemency. But from one prison and later Clemency, 2 of my films and then others have become our recruiting and educational tools. They're also co-sponsored by Amnesty International, and From One Prison was also sponsored by Human Rights Watch, who showed it all over the world. And then the ACLU has sponsored some, and other organizations. But they're also shown in traditional art venues, galleries, museums, theaters. So they kind of do triple duty. Early on, and then they're distributed free to activists. It became important to me as I built close friendships with these women that I wanted to work on their cases. I wanted to do more. We talked about that some this morning, and I just really got sucked in more and more. But it's a constant balancing act even now to work my roles out as an artist and activist and educator. They're all interdependent, but it's also about trying to balance that. One of the frustrations I faced with this work is censorship in all shapes and forms and sizes. I guess it's in part the reality factor of filming some taboo subjects in ways that counter mainstream media depictions, and the censorious climate that we've lived with for the last, especially 20 years during the right-wing culture wars, especially against women's and artists' rights. When I was interviewing women coming out of jail on prostitution charges, one problem was a judge who kept threatening to have me arrested, even though I was on public property, outdoors, on the sidewalks. And when I was she never did have me arrested, by the way. And when I exhibited that work, it was taken down, covered over, defaced, including by the University of Michigan Law School, Catherine McKinnon, who was the censor. Despite the fact that there was no nudity, though it was politically explicit, prostitutes' rights viewpoint. That occurred in the early 90s before I was teaching there. And getting hired there is another battle story I won't bore you with, but I spent a year doing battle with the law school and Lee Bollinger, who was the dean, now you may know president of Columbia University. And ultimately we won, and the law school had to reinstall the whole show a year later. It was an important victory for prostitutes' rights, for feminist art, and for anti-censorship feminism. During this time that I was doing battle with the law school, I was also going inside the prison to film, and I never knew what obstacles I was facing inside, or we'd face, because I had a camera woman with me. Guards would jump in front of the camera and make me erase footage. A warden seized my tapes once and sent them to the state. I eventually got them back. A deputy warden threatened to kick me out for asking questions about corruption among the guards. And another time I received a letter from the state calling me a controversial figure who would not be allowed to access public information again. And then another time I received a letter from the Department of Corrections demanding to see my film before it was finished or distributed. The ACLU advised me to ignore the demand, which I did. And then another risk we talked about this morning is worrying about the women changing their mind or feeling that I'm not doing enough or whatever, or a lawsuit. I mean, doing this work is taking risks, and you don't do this work without making enemies. And even among some of the attorneys and other activists. In the late 90s, though, I was stopped cold from going inside the prison with a camera because the governor issued a statewide media ban on all cameras in all state prisons, and recorders and even reporters. And that's remained in place for over a decade now. The ban was basically retribution for the investigations that were being conducted in the women's prisons by Amnesty, the UN, the U.S. Justice Department, the Clemency Project, and lawsuits brought by courageous women prisoners. In their 1999 report, Not Part of My Sentence, Amnesty named Michigan as one of the worst prison systems in the nation for women with regard to sexual assault, medical neglect, harassment, retaliation, 4-point chaining, and other atrocities against the women. whether it's in the name of security or offense, these are some of my photographic works, usually based on stills from my films. Whether for security reasons or offense, censorship seems to be the first tool of an abuser or an abusive system. So it became more important than ever to me to find ways after the media ban to go inside, as well as find ways to film. Since then, I go in as a legal assistant, and I can go in and out any time, since I recruit and work with attorneys, investigate cases, write clemency petitions and parole packages. And I've continued to make films with women inside or recently released. Mostly those inside have furnished somehow footage that they've helped me obtain, some of it shot by guards or police. Most of my films are short. They're running 10 to 30 minutes, except for From One Prison, which was a longer piece, 70 minutes. And they examine different issues in going on in the prison. One is about censorship, what the women can't talk about, and one was strategies of resistance that they used inside to protect and support each other. Another was about the torture, the 4-point chaining. Sometimes I call our legal director and say, I'm going to go drive around the prison today, or I got a student who has an airplane and I'm going to fly over. So if I get in any trouble, I'm just letting you know. With about 2,000 women in Michigan prisons, it's about the same number here in Pennsylvania, I believe, in the women's prisons. There are a lot of issues to focus on. If only documentarians and reporters could get in. I am constantly trying to get reporters in. The number of women prisoners nationwide has escalated dramatically over the years due to the war on crime and drugs, largely because women, especially women of color, have been demonized and criminalized through an endless recycling of mythologies, disconnected from our real and often structurally and personally violent contexts. About 80% of incarcerated women are serving time for nonviolent, poverty-induced crimes. 50 to 80% are black, although only 13% of the population is black, and they don't commit more crimes than white women. And poor, though poor women don't commit more crimes than middle or upper class women. They're struggling to feed their kids, their habits, their dreams, the best they can in an unequal and unjust society. Many would not be there at all if they were men, because of far fewer drug treatment, tether, and alternative programs for women per capita, and because of gender-based crimes, such as prostitution, domestic violence, duress, or bad checks written to support kids whose fathers are not held accountable by the law, and which, as Julie Pearl demonstrated some years back, all provide easy arrests for police who are manipulating the system. As for the women serving time for murder, legal and other scholars have raised a number of injustices affecting these cases. Some argue that the major problem is prosecutorial abuse and misconduct. Dr. Angela J. Davis, not the prisoner rights activist, but this professor is at Washington University, wrote a fascinating book I recommend called Arbitrary Justice and Prosecutorial Misconduct. In the case of battered women, prosecutors routinely trot out every myth and stereotype to convict a woman and deny her a fair trial. Other scholars argue the biggest problem is judges because they apply the law unjustly, exclude evidence, deny or otherwise give inadequate self-defense instructions to juries. But I guess most legal scholars, Holly McGuigan, Sarah Buell, Elizabeth Snyder, many others, and activists such as Sue Ostoff, who we have in our audience today, from the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women here in Philadelphia, point out that judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and jurors all bring an astonishing level of incompetence and ignorance about battered women to the courtroom. Many women who are in prison now were never allowed to present evidence of abuse at all, which left them with no defense. And they're serving life or close to it. Some are facing the death penalty. Only since about '92 has the law in many states allowed expert testimony, but it's usually on battered woman syndrome or battered spouse syndrome, it's called in Michigan. And many of those laws, including Michigan's, are so restrictive, they're worthless. Today, most feminists agree that battered woman syndrome, a term you may know was coined by Dr. Lenore Walker to describe the so-called learned helplessness of a woman who's been battered, is problematic because it pathologizes women, does not fit their survival responses, especially for those of women of color. And it also confuses judges and juries who are left wondering if a woman on trial is suffering from this syndrome instead of whether she acted in her own defense. Actually, most women, 70 to 85%, never go to trial at all, but are convinced to plead guilty because their court-appointed attorneys don't have the money or time to investigate and present their cases effectively, and because the risk of a first-degree murder conviction is very real, since self-defense law does not work for women in these cases. We published a study of all the homicides in one county in Michigan in the Hastings Women's Law Journal last year. It was covering a 3-year period in the late 1980s because that covered a number of our cases, and found a startling level of discrimination against defendants who were victims of domestic violence, including Karen Kanzler here on her rap sheet. And you may or may not be able to read her judge's, an excerpt from her judge's affidavit stating that he made a serious and tragic error in her case, and he's been trying to get her out since 1993 unsuccessfully. And these women received higher conviction rates and longer sentences than all others, including men with criminal histories. So the findings were worse than we thought. When we did the study, we thought, well, we won't publish this if it doesn't come out well, like we think it's going to, but it was worse than we expected. Some of the problems that have been identified for battered women in the courts include that reasonable and woman seem to be treated like an oxymoron. In other words, the reasonable man is the standard, while women's acts are seen as hysterical, unreasonable, unnecessary, despite the fact that she may be acting reasonably in the face of deadly violence. Karen was in hand-to-hand combat with her husband, who was a doctor, when she shot him. The rule of imminence is another one that is not understood in the context of a woman who's been brutalized. A history of abuse may tell her that deadly violence is imminent, that he's going to kill her this time, in the next moment, or the next hour, or the next day. And that may not be immediate, but it is nonetheless imminent. And then the rule of deadly harm or death carries an underlying assumption that two people are of equal size and strength, like two men duking it out in a bar. But that doesn't fit women's experiences either. And it punishes women who try to equalize by picking up a weapon or a lamp or something to balance out the strength difference. Then many scholars note that the rule of necessity, even though some states have ruled against necessity to retreat before someone acts in self-defense, the question still rules. Why didn't she leave? Instead of why didn't the law stop him? A judge in one of our cases, Judge McDonald in the Nancy Seaman case just 3 years ago, was horrified, to his credit, but too late, when the jury convicted her of murder one, non-parolable life, and then jurors were on TV saying, well, she could have left, and well, she wasn't some trembling little baby, and she was an educated teacher, and so on. The mainstream media still paints these women as black widows. But there was sufficient evidence of abuse, and the judge realized that too late and tried to change the verdict. But of course, the prosecutor appealed, and the murder one conviction was reinstated. Now all her appeals have failed. And like Karen Kanzler's judge, we have, and Nancy Seaman's judge, we have a number of judges working with us who were on the cases or had some relation to the cases who regret how they handled them, but even they can't get the women released now. Each spring we organize a rotating roster of volunteers who work with us mostly in the summer. They include attorneys, former and current prisoners, domestic violence professionals, doctors, other professionals, and lots of students, sometimes for credit or internships. Many come who've seen my films. And our visibility strategies include, of course, the films that I distribute free, but our annual rallies at the state capitol and other events to get press coverage, and our website and brochures. Oh, I have some here, by the way. Yeah, right here. And we also publish articles and op-ed pieces, and I teach women in prison and human rights courses at the university. We also collaborate with a lot of other organizations on the laws, parole practices, sentencing guidelines, and opposing the human rights abuses in the prison. Our collaborators also include the University of Michigan Law School, which they've forgiven me now, or at least a few people have forgiven me, not McKinnon, but they have just initiated a new non-DNA innocence project. And then also I wanted to mention all of my films and raw footage are going soon to the graduate library for scholars, and because we need so much research on these areas around women in jails and prisons. As for our successes in the Clemency Project, they've been too few to count. In 98, 99, as I mentioned, we freed Violet Allen and Juanita Thomas through motions for relief from judgment, and they were two of the women in From One prison. But our similar motions have failed again and again since then. We've assisted a dozen or so now in obtaining paroles, mostly this year. And that's a small victory in a state where the parole board feeds the bloated prison industry without a thought, probably because most of those members on the parole board are former cops and sheriffs. Just this year, we've had our first 2 clemencies, both for elderly and very ill women. I've spent a lot of time in parole hearings and testifying at public hearings this year. Those public hearings are brutal, verbally assaultive experiences, and my students were horrified who sat in on one recently. So, but we do have hope for more, because it's been a painful reality check to see some releases happening for the first time in 17 years that I've been doing this, only because our state is virtually bankrupt. And so they're being forced to cut down on and close prisons. Clemency is, of course, a long shot because it does nothing for a politician's career. So they've declined nationwide over the years. Nevertheless, for women serving life, there's just no other option. after they've exhausted all their appeals. And Clemency also, of course, does nothing to change the systems that are failing, so we also continue to expand our strategies. Ultimately, as Dr. Angela Y. Davis, the prisoner rights activist and professor at UC Santa Cruz, argues, a broadly based abolition movement against woman abuse, the death penalty, and the brutality and obsolescence of prisons can pose a challenge to our corrupt punishment industry if we continue to imagine and create real alternatives to prison, including healthcare, housing, drug treatment, and mental health programs, and that can give us hope. For me, working with indomitable feminists on both sides of the fence is what keeps me going. And so now I would like to show you 3 film clips. This first one from one prison, and we got 3 of these women out since I made this film, but we are working on trying to get the 4th woman out.
When I first got to prison, I thought my life was over. I felt like I was a failure, that there was probably nothing left in my life to live for. I also felt anger. I felt a lot of hurt because of not being understood. I felt hurt because of my children that were now taken away from me. I felt like everything that I had thought was right and good was destroyed. I'd always believed in a criminal justice system that worked. I believed that if you were right and you defended yourself, that was understood. I found out it wasn't. I found out that it's who has the money. I found out it's whether you're a man or a woman. I found out that it's how they want to play the court game when you go through the system.
And you've been here?
I've been in prison for 9 years now, almost 9 years. It's been a long time. And I've watched my children grow up. My youngest one, I've been away from him longer than I was ever with him. I'm thankful that they're all well and that they're okay. I'm thankful that I still have their love and their support. I'm thankful that whether the court system understood or whether anybody else that in the system understood, my sons understood.
I live one day at a time. Yeah. I found it easier for me to do. And that's how I coped all these years.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of bad incidents, but I keep going. I've had surgery since I've been here. I've lost my mother to cancer. I've lost my only brother, and I don't see my kids too much anymore. And when I left, they were small. Now they all grown up, you know. And I hardly ever see them. And that's a hard thing to deal with. So as I say, I just take one day at a time. And you force yourself to go on. Some days it's hard, you know, but you force yourself to do it because you know you got to do it. There are strict rules, and if you don't do it, there's a penalty, so you find yourself doing it. Sometimes you don't know how yourself, you know. And you keep believing that somebody's going to come along and believe in justice and that you're going to get another chance. And I feel I deserve another chance. I don't feel I should be put away for life without parole to rot for something that I could keep from doing. If I wanted to do it, I could have did it a long time ago, but I had no plans of doing it.
You know, had I had somewhere to go, I wouldn't be here, and he'd still be alive. You know, and it's something that every battered woman has to somehow deal with the fact that she did take a life, although even after all this time, it's so hard for me to believe. It's like, I know I did. I'm sitting here. But it's like, how can I? I'm such an easygoing, compassionate person. How could I have possibly been capable of this? Could nobody have ever told me? I would have told them they was crazy. As people always say, I could never do that. But if you was in a predicament to where your life or your children's life was at stake, what would you do? You couldn't turn to nobody. There was nowhere to go. And at that split moment, you don't have time to think, how would you protect your child, yourself? You know, you don't think about it, you react. It's human nature to protect yourself.
I think you live every day in prison with the hopes that this appeal will get you out or the next appeal will get you out. And at the time that I came to prison, they had told me that I would probably do from 7 to 10 years in prison. So I also believed that. Then later on they told me that, you know, lifers were doing from 10 to 15 years. So I believed that. Now I've done 16 years and I have no idea what's expected, what they want me to do. I've done everything that I can do while I've been in prison.
I first went into a women's prison in 1989. Emotionally and professionally, I haven't left since. I found myself drawn to women who were serving life. I had not known who the convicted murderers are in our women's prisons. I listened to them, I studied their faces, I researched their histories, and I was stunned. I saw myself.
I do know when this 6-foot, 200-pound man was on top of me, groping me and kissing me and slobbering on me and feeling me and touching me, all I could think about was the previous rape, and I didn't want it to happen again. And at that point in time, I was willing to do whatever to stop it. At both of my trials, my attorney asked the judge to tailor the jury instructions to say that a woman has a right to use deadly force to prevent a sexual assault. The judge refused to do this at both of the trials. My attorney was quite adamant about it. He wanted the jury instructions not only to say first degree, second degree manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, but that a woman does have a right to use deadly force to prevent a sexual assault.
At my trial, we had an abuse expert. My defense was temporary insanity because I don't remember actually shooting my husband. I remember getting the gun out and I was going to shoot myself because I couldn't go on. In the last minute I thought of my children, that if I do this, then my children will be left with him, and what will they go through? And then the next thing I consciously remember is being back in the living room and realizing what I had done.
And I was still in a state of shock because of everything that had happened to me. Nobody explained to me my rights. Nobody really explained to me what had happened to me. I had an attorney who more or less passed it off as one more performance, one more case to put on a show to the courtroom. A judge who had no comprehension of what domestic violence was about. He had no training in the background. It was just another murder case. So the systems failed me completely all the way through.
Well, where I worked at Michigan State, and I had got so shaky and nervous I couldn't hardly function on my job. So there was a lady that I was kind of close to. Her name was Sally Brighton. She worked in human relations. And I started talking to her. That's the only thing, you know, only person I came in contact really talking to about stuff like that. I didn't know nothing about the shelter, nothing like that, because the police never told us about that. Only thing they would say was, leave home. They didn't say where to go. They didn't care. They just said, leave, give him the house until he cools off. And some days it's cooling off. Sometimes cooling off period would be 2 days. Had been up to 3 days sometimes. So I didn't know anything about that until after.
This last piece I made since the blackout in 2000 with a woman who got out of prison and sued the state of Michigan for torture and won a settlement of $92,000, which is nothing, given that she was chained down over and over a period of 4 years. Okay.
The time is 21,2600 hours. I'm Sergeant Allmer, and we are going to escort prisoner Whitcomb, and her number is 168724. She's just been returned from Huron Valley Crisis Stabilization Unit, and we're going to admit her into segregation, upper segregation 5. Watch this down. Here, door. Watch this down. Then we'll go down.
Wait, lift up. I got it.
She's in.
That's it.
Okay. Talk that lady. Oh,
She
ain't in.
Well, we'll hold her in.
Come on. That's all.
Tilt the wheelchair back. Tilt the wheelchair back.
Let's go. Yeah, no, I got it.
Tilt it back. I got it. We got one here.
Elevate.
I got it. You take the front. Okay.
Okay. Got it.
Tell them to have the elevator ready in the stand. Call up.
Call say, get the elevator ready.
They got wait. I got it. Y'all take your step. Okay, close it up.
Okay, everybody clear. Okay.
I got no room.
Meet them upstairs and knock them in the room.
Okay, that sees you over.
Hot in here.
We're going to the shower or what? That's fine. We'll read 5.
Break 5. Let's go through all of this.
Okay, take them off. Take them off while we have them like this.
4-point restraints being
Electrical engineer Ray Miles,
restraint application already in process upon arrival on the scene. Prisoners complying at this time.
The longest I was chained down at one period of time was for 19-20 days.
Night and day.
Night and day. When I first was chained down for that long period of time, I didn't know what was going on. You're supposed to, per policy, have hearings to determine if your behavior or some psychological defect or whatever, if you meet the criteria to be chained down. That usually never happens. Never happens. It never happened with me.
Today is 6/15/94. The time is 4:05. At this time, I want to place prisoner on top of bed restraints.
They had an upper segregation and a lower segregation. And lower seg was just for people that never complained about anything. And upper segregation was designated SMPU, which is Self-Mutilator Prevention Unit. They housed mental patients in there too. And they had concrete slabs with just a mattress thrown on top of it, and they could chain you down.
And they can transport you then up and down at will, from the downstairs level to the upstairs segregation.
Exactly.
No! How long are they going to keep me tied down?
Depends a lot on you. As all of this does. You know that.
Yeah, but what if I be good and they don't let me go?
That isn't going to happen because they got a whole new program and all you have to do is follow it.
And what is it? What is it, Sergeant? Tell me.
If I knew it, I could tell you, but I don't know it, first of all. And I'm not the one to tell you because we've got quite a few people on the team, and they're going to sit down and explain it to you. And it's okay, from the little bit I do know, it sounds like it's going to be easy for you to follow it.
What, am I the only one or something? Am I the only one tied down?
At the moment you are. That doesn't mean that, there can't be other people.
Well, I'm the only one so far.
Jamie, we're not doing this to you as a punishment. It's a preventive so you don't hurt yourself.
My brother and I had gotten to an argument, and it escalated into a fight, and after he broke my hand, I went out and got a baseball bat from our downstairs and smashed out his truck windows.
And for that you served?
A little over 4 years. You wouldn't think that that much time the crime would be malicious destruction of property over $100.
I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I used to be a journalist, and I'm old enough to say that was from the days when print ruled. I guess I kind of wondered, and this goes back to my bias, I suppose, but you mentioned early on, Carol, that you talked about your art. Mm-hmm. And indeed, your presentations truly are artful, but I guess I wonder if they get perceived that way and somehow there's they're not considered to be factual. They're not journalism, I guess, if you will, or they're not perceived that way. And if that doesn't perhaps take something away from them. And I had another comment. A few years back, we were working with the Lifers group at Graterford, a group of very bright men who are serving life sentences and who had decided that the only way to really make a difference was for them to attempt to end the culture of street crime. Are you guys going to do anything like that? Well, their plan was based on the fact that they figured they were the only ones who really had the direct experience and the credibility with the population, that they could talk to their peers in the prison and get them to somehow change their behavior when they did get out. They weren't getting out, these guys, but the ones that they were trying to work with were the ones that were going out. So they worked on this and for a long time, and they formed little groups, and every Saturday the superintendent there at Graterford allowed other groups to come down and talk to them, and they would talk about why one shouldn't do drugs on the street. Because while you might make some money that you dearly need, you're really ravaging that community. And all of these guys had families still living in those communities. So they wanted to make that appeal, and I worked with Kay Harris, who teaches at Temple, and we worked with these guys over a period of time, and they actually developed a paper that they published in the Prison Journal. It was a very thoughtful piece, and it came out around the time that there was the World Congress on Criminology that was being held here at Penn a few years back. So we invited 200 criminologists from all over the world to go to Graterford and hear a presentation about this paper that they had published. And I thought, geez, this is really striking stuff, you know. And if they're willing to come up here and do this, we really should get some coverage of this thing. We should get some media in here and record it, whatnot. Well, the idea about having media there got shot down like that. And then the idea of just recording it. Let's do a video. No way. Let's do audio. No way. No recording whatsoever. And we had all these really distinguished scholars spread out on the stage there in the auditorium, and interspersed were, of course, inmates. And they had this rather lively discussion of their paper and you know, why people thought it held water and was a good paper. But there's no records of it. And when they ask, well, why is this? Why do we try to take away the identity of the individuals? Why do we refuse to let people see what's actually going on inside? Why do we refuse to let people on the outside see that people on the inside do have their good moments? They're just like anybody else. They're not always doing bad things, committing crimes and whatnot. And that's perhaps one of the unanswerable questions here, I suppose. Nobody wants to be challenged in their work. I don't know if it's a matter of wanting to forestall any kind of challenge to authority or just to, well, I'm not sure what it is. But I think when I think about what is the purpose of prisons, and you think about long-term, what is public safety all about? Unless we're going to keep people forever and never let them out again, which I don't think we have become so inhumane that we're intending to do that, although we do have a pretty good start at it in Pennsylvania with a lot of our laws here. But unless we're going to do that, our public safety, the interest of our public safety, is not well served by the continual demonization of the individuals who are in this system. We had a shooting here a police shooting in the city, which I suspect many of you are aware of, a month or so ago, and it was a pretty vile occurrence, and the individual had just gotten out of prison on parole, and it was, I believe, the 5th police shooting in a matter of 2 years. And of course, the immediate reaction was, who do we blame? Let's blame the judge for giving him too short a sentence. Let's blame parole because they let him out after 10 years when they could have kept him for 12. You know, who is it that deserves blame for this? And the thought, I think, that really struck me is, what did we do with this guy for 10 years? What attempt was made to deal with whatever it was he was dealing with, to try and get him ready to come back and be a different person? I don't think we can change everybody, but I think we can do a heck of a lot better a job than we have been doing, and that requires a little bit, I think, of different thinking. You know, the immediate reaction of the governor was, let's impose a freeze on all parole releases. Well, that was brilliant. Our prisons are operating at 117% of capacity today, and by eliminating parole for a month, we're adding 1,100 more people to the system. 1,100 people every month. So now the word is that apparently he's going to relent on the parole freeze in the case of nonviolent offenders, assuming they can agree on who nonviolent offenders are. They'll do that first and then see what happens. But it is, that's indicative, I believe, of the kind of knee-jerk response and public policy making that we have that has put us in this position and gotten us where we are. One final thing, we talked a little about this at lunch, and Carol mentioned the state being in bankruptcy or near bankruptcy, and that's the reason for trying to get people out of the system. You know, I mean, we have the same problem. I think they have the same problem pretty much in every state, but we're still building here. We have 3 new prisons on the drawing boards, and there really is no end in sight. There are 170 more prisoners entering the system every month, and this is before the parole freeze, than get out, which means by the end of the year you need to have a new prison. And there's no place else to put them. We shut down Pittsburgh, 3 years ago, and then immediately had to turn around and reopen it and fill it right back up again. So unless we can get beyond the kind of politics that we're confronted with, which says, not me, you know, I'm not going to be the one to vote for that, or I'm not going to introduce that bill because that'll be my hide. And until we get to, and I think that one of the first things you mentioned was what's going on with the media. My heart's in the media, and they have done an awful job. They don't cover this story anymore. Philadelphia Inquirer used to have a woman 10 years ago, that's all she covered was prisons. She's done. She left. Nobody covers prisons now. In order to get a reporter in to cover a story, if it's a print reporter, they're allowed to bring in a tablet and a pencil. They've got to be on somebody's visitors list if they want to interview somebody. And forget about television, radio. I mean, they just are not going to get their equipment in quickly enough to be able to cover the story while it's still timely. So instead of fighting that, which I think the media should have done and should do, they've just walked away from it. They have no one covering the story anymore. They only cover it when it's a disaster. So we have a lot of challenges before us, and I hope that you're going to continue with your work, and we'll be able to meet some of them.